is our second public forum for the fiscal year 26 budget. And right now, the target date for the Board of Education to vote on the budget is April 15th. And our teams at the district office are working with our school leaders this week to finalize budgets in order to get ready for that vote later in April. And so we will be sharing more with you about the process during this presentation. So we have been, some of you might remember that we have been communicating the narrative or our story relative to the persistent, the ongoing structural deficit, the gaps that exist in our funding, which is a result of what we call flat revenue. Revenue is the money that comes in, and also rising costs, right? The money that has to go out for us to pay, if you will, the cost of operating our schools and meeting the needs of our students, especially the difficulties with budget in terms of special education and tuition. So we went over some of that historical information at the last community forum. And ultimately, what we need is change to happen within our system and then externally, outside of the system. First, we need at the local, municipal, at the city level, we need support, and we also need action at the state level to create sustainable revenue. And by that, we mean money that comes in year after year, sustainable, that it can continue. And also, we also need support to address the cost drivers, the reasons for the budget deficits that we continue to have that are out of our control. And then internally, we always have an obligation to pass a balanced budget. For me, to present to the board a budget that is balanced, and for the board to vote on that budget. And that is a challenge. It presents also an opportunity to think about the funds and the resources that we do have and try to make those as closely aligned as much as possible to have those match the new strategic plan that we've just finished, and then the investments that we know will matter most for students. And we'll share some of those proposed options with you tonight. So I was just saying that our fiscal budget for 2026, that budget presents both the challenges, but also opportunities. So while the revenue, remember, revenue is the money that comes in, it is projected to increase by 2.1%, largely due to the final phase in of that additional state education cost share funding. We also see that there will be expenses that will increase. So by 4.9. So yes, money that comes in is going to increase by 2.1%, but the expenses is increasing by 4.9. So there's still a gap between those two percentages. And so the key reasons for the increases is our salaries, right? Because we have to pay salaries based on contractual obligations. Also, because of the rising costs relative to special education and transportation costs and just day-to-day inflation, right? We all know that everything is costing more as the days go by. And as a result of those reasons, we now face a $30 million gap, even with what we call a flat service budget, which means that if we're keeping everything that we're doing right now into next year, the same programming, the same staffing levels, we still are looking at a $30 million gap. And that gap, right, points to how important it is for us to be really, really smart, very strategic about how we invest the resources and also the need to continue to collaborate with the state, advocate at the state, partner and advocate at the city level with our local leaders as well, so that we can maintain those essential services for our students and supports for our staff. So we have developed budget guiding principles to keep us focused, if you will, during this process. And at the center of all of it is that we want to make sure that we have the resources that all of our students need to be successful. So we'll walk through each of the pieces of these three guiding principles, but at the center of it, I want you all to remember that we really want to make sure that our students have equal access and opportunity. So the first is making sure that the budget is developed in support of the strategic plan priorities, which the board voted on at the February 18th meeting, which I'm thinking many of you perhaps contributed to the design and the feedback that inform the strategic plan priorities. And so we want to ensure that the budget decisions at all levels, at the school level, at the central office, at the board level, that they are grounded and aligned and in support of the strategic plan. The second is financial sustainability. Remember that sustainability is that we want to make sure that the resources that come in are here year after year after year. And so the second one around financial sustainability, yes, there is uncertainty around state and city, the additional funding at the state and city level. And we still have a responsibility to develop a balanced budget as we continue to advocate for additional funding and as we learn new information, right? We learn about some commitments that at the state level that they're looking to make. And so we follow that very closely, but at the same time, we cannot pause on the development of the budget. And we're thinking also about short term and the long term. What are the ways to reduce spending now that doesn't impact students and teachers at all or very little? And could there be a redesign in longer term to have more sustainable funding and sustainable programming and supports for our students across our schools? And lastly, the last piece here is what we call research-based best practices. We want to make sure that the decisions that are made relative to the resources and the investments that are made with the resources, that there is a body of research that shows that that we're getting the biggest bang, if you will, for the resources that are going to be invested. Again, and that we're able to sustain those over time. So that was an overview a little bit about the reasons why we continue to face, right, the gaps between the money that comes in, the money that goes out, and the guiding principles and what's going to keep us focused during this budget development process. And so now to get at some of the information from our community forum and the ideas and suggestions and opinions that we've heard, I'm going to tag in our Chief Financial Officer, Caitlin Richard.
Thank you so much, and good evening, everyone. Glad to have you here. We're going to go through some new information now, so updates from the last time, and then more information about the school budget process. What I'll ask is if you have questions, please just put those in the chat, and then I'll pause at certain points in the presentation, and we can go through those questions. You'll also have an opportunity to do a survey at the end, which both is asking for any additional questions, but then input you have on some of what we're sharing tonight. So just throw those questions in the chat, then I'll pause and we'll go through those at some specific moments. So since we did our last community forum about a month ago, we asked you all at that time to help us solve the problem. And so the folks who attended that meeting had the task of solving that $30 million deficit that the superintendent talked about through a combination of additions and cuts. So we summarized this feedback, and I'm about to show you some of what we heard from you. We also brought this to the Board of Education so they could use it to inform decision making. And what we'll share with you tonight is a new working list of reduction options based on some of that feedback and based on just some of the other additional information, working with the board, et cetera, on that front. So we took some of what you gave us, have been looking at that, reviewing it, and I'll share that with you in a minute. Also on the legislative advocacy front, we're working really closely with the city to try to secure additional funding for some of our specific programs that we're currently funding. We've also been working at the state legislative level, and I'll have an update actually on a specific bill that we want all of you to be advocating for because it would mean big changes for us for Hartford. And so we'll go through kind of those pieces of, all right, where are we at in terms of some of our reduction options and where are we at with some of that legislative advocacy? And I'll say these two play into each other, right? So there's a dynamic with, as we learn more about the legislative action, we will update the amount that we need to reduce from our deficit. And so these are, there's an interplay right now. And so we are going to keep coming back to you with updates as we get new information. So to start off in this category of deficit mitigation, I wanted to just share with you some of what we heard from the folks who attended the last community forum. You can take a look at this slide, and just some of the things that stood out was just these are the priorities if we were to add to the budget, or another way to look at it is what should we most preserve in some of the programming that we have. So classroom paras, counselors, social workers, bonuses for hard to staff positions, those all rose to the top from what we heard last time from you all. So this was really helpful in just knowing these are some of the most important pieces in the budget. And we also, heard things like make sure to prioritize based on student interest and needs, really catering to what they're interested in. So this is some of what we heard from you all the last time. Again, on the things, if we were to add to the budget, what would we add, or kind of what is most important to preserve? When it came to some of the budget cuts, you can see kind of in order there as well what some of the community feedback was from the last session. Definitely in the highest category around administrative roles, so school, district, also non-instructional school positions was fairly high on that front. And so again, we were looking at this just to hear what, given that we have a $30 million deficit, where are some of the first places that we should look as we're thinking through these options, knowing, we're going to have to pursue multiple different options to tackle this problem, but this helped us and also our board just get a sense of how folks were thinking about this. So thank you to everyone who participated in that the previous time. And again, you'll have a time today to take a survey to continue to give us input. So this next slide is kind of an update on some of those options. So we presented you a set of them the last time. We got feedback, again, not only from you all, but also from other stakeholder groups, and also just looking at the budget, what are the different categories where we need to focus. So this is where we stand right now on some of those reduction options. I'll go through them, and we're going to dive deeper into the school-based ones during that section of the presentation. But I will call out, even before we go into it, the ones we have here only total to $15 million. And so we will need to make additional reductions if we don't get additional funding from the city or state. So that's, like I said, there's an interplay here between what we're able to get in terms of additional revenue and then what we need to reduce in our own budget. So going through some of these, and like I said, feel free to ask questions in the chat. Also, we will be covering many of these in the next section on school budgets. But one is just around the general education staffing ratios. This was about, what we did is update some of the formulas. And so again, we'll go into detail about that, but it's about one position per school. Some of that is driven by enrollment. So if enrollment is expected to be lower next year than it was last year, there'll be a change there. Some of it is some of the changes we made to the formula. I will say, and this is important, part of that level service budget did not include the positions that were restored with one-time funding. So we got one-time funding from the state for this year to restore a set of positions that were supposed to be cut last year. Those positions are not included. So some schools might be experiencing a bigger decrease than just what the formula or enrollment would dictate. But a lot of that is because there were certain positions in there that were named as just one time.
CFO Richard, can we just
Yeah.
pause a minute? 'Cause I see it in the chat that there's translation captions are freezing and can't
Oh,
keep
okay.
up with the pace of the speech. So I don't know if it means the pace of your speech for CFO Richard or the translation. So I just
And
paused it.
I'm happy to slow down if that would
In
be
general. Okay, so yes, slow down.
okay. And in general, okay, I can definitely slow down. I just get too excited about the budget, but I will slow it down. So just to reiterate, recap what I just said, that was just around the general education. So the teachers allocated to buildings, that change was about one per school. However, some schools have changes, bigger changes if they received one-time funding from the state this year for certain positions that were meant to be cut for last year. The next piece there is around some of those non-certified positions for school sites. So those are things like an FCSSP, a student engagement specialist, a behavior tech. And so what we did there, and we'll go into more detail when we get into the more information about school budgets. But basically, we didn't allocate those positions directly to schools. We gave them their Title I, so their discretionary funding, to make decisions about which of those positions they wanted. We also added an office assistant, so we made sure that every single school site had an office assistant. So that was an update as well. And again, we'll see more of how that works and what the Title I funding is in the next section.
Team, we didn't talk about when the questions will be entertained, but I just want to flag that there are a couple questions or comments, and so just flagging it in case we want to pause and answer now or answer later.
Yeah, I think maybe I'll just finish this slide and then I can go through the questions about this slide. I think that will work because I figured this slide probably has some of the most questions. So thanks for flagging that. So just covering the last couple pieces and then I will go to those questions. Another option on the table is around security guard allocations. So those are specifically positions that are not allocated directly to school sites, but they float around schools. So they'll go to multiple different schools. So that would be a potential reduction. As well, the magnet supplement. So this was something that was being phased out over time. So over the past few years, the plan was to phase out this type of funding. It wasn't to remove it all at once, to kind of give a runway for those changes to happen. And so this would be kind of the last year of that funding, and it would fully phase it out for next year. That was something kind of included historically, but like I said, has been being phased out over time, with this year being the last year. We also are planning cuts at the central office level. So this would be both to central office positions and also to just non-personnel expenditures. So kind of any of those non-salary items. So district teams are working right now to figure out where those reductions will be in a way that minimizes interrupting services to school sites. So really thinking about what are the most important positions to preserve for delivering services to schools, but knowing we will still make reductions in that area. And the last piece is really around setting targets for things like special education door-to-door transportation. So of course, making sure all students are getting what they need, but just making sure that it's really only the students who need something in particular that are receiving that service. And those would be more just targets or goals for the next year, knowing that those are some really big expenses in our budget. So those are some of the kind of options on the table. A lot of them you saw last time. Now there's a bit more detail or nuance to them. And so now I will head to the chat. I don't know, Paul, if there's particular ones you want to raise. I'm just trying to see both the chat and the screen.
Yeah, I can go in order. There's one that is it's more of a comment, but just lifting the significant role FCSSPs play in partnership with families and building relationships and running workshops. And I don't know if you want to mention kind of the board's kind of guardrail around FCSSPs.
Yeah, they had the same feeling about FCSSPs, and so all schools will be required to have at least a 0.5, so at least a half of an FCSSP next year, which is the same guardrail that was in place for this year. So the board also felt like that role in particular was one that we want to make sure school sites still have.
The next question was, what are the ages and grades are we talking about? And so I think that's in reference to the general ed staffing ratios. So what grades and ages does it apply to?
Yeah, we can, I'm going to show you more detail about the specific grade levels on that front. So I'm going to hold that just until we get to that slide so you can see exactly what grade levels we're talking about.
Those, I believe, are the only questions at this moment.
I just want to make sure that there was a comment about the difference in the translation, or that it's not translating according. I'm not sure if that's a.
Yeah, the captions that you see is really small. You're gonna see it's like talking random stuff. I don't know. That's what it's doing.
So I think I might have one answer. So Caitlin, I don't know if yours is set. When I started speaking and giving questions, my Zoom told me that it thought my language was Spanish, but it didn't hear me speaking in Spanish. And so I switched the language I was speaking into English. I don't know if it's got you speaking Spanish.
Huh.
That's
I did
impacting
not see that pop up, but I can look.
Do you know where to look?
No, where would
Next
that
to where
be?
it says recording. There's a to the right of where it says recording. In
Yeah.
mine, it says EN for English.
Okay, let me just, I think I have to, I'm just gonna stop this screen share for 1 sec.
Thank you for your patience, everybody. Want to make sure that everyone understands.
Yeah, it says English.
That may not be the issue. I just
No, it's helpful to try anything because I want to make sure folks can understand.
And there's also a Spanish. Oh, I can tag in our translator, or if not, I can. You know, I can't resist, so let me just back up and let the translator do her job. Okay, we have someone saying the Spanish interpretation is working. And then Perla, she wants to know about, oh, she says you're don't talk too fast. She wants to know about special education, what is going to happen with the reductions, the reductions in the budget, and the services, making sure that there are no reductions to the services.
Yes. And I will talk slower. So that is really about just evaluating as students in their individualized education plans or IEPs are getting services, that it's just, we're making sure that it's only the kids who need door to door. And so what that means is it's picking up at your home and taking you to school. And there's definitely students who need that, and we're going to keep offering those services. But it's basically just evaluating to make sure that is true in all the cases that's being offered. That's because, so for transportation alone, we spend $30 million, and actually 23 million of that is on the special education door to door. So this is more saying we want to look at this and just make sure it's the students who need it and need it the most who are getting those services. And just evaluate that. So setting a goal or a target around that front, but students who need those services would absolutely continue to receive them.
CFO Richards, I apologize for interrupting. It seems like a lot of people are joining and they missed the introduction piece where I asked for the translating in the channel. So I'm going to say that one more time because I just want to make sure that we capture everyone's questions and hear everyone's voice. So, para todos los oyentes que acaban de entrar al Zoom, mire hacia el lado derecho de la barra del menú en la parte inferior de la pantalla. Haga clic en el botón que contiene una imagen del globo terráqueo y seleccione en español para escuchar la traducción. También puede volver a hacer clic en el icono del globo terráqueo y seleccionar Mute Original Audio Channel si no desea escuchar el audio en inglés en lo absoluto. Y también dejar mensaje en inglés y en español en el chat para que puedan seguir las instrucciones para poder conectarse con nuestra traductora, la señora Alba. All set.
Thank you for doing that
Sure.
again.
Another question that did come in is a sort of a process question. Is there a location where we can review slides and recordings from previous forums? And it's noting that the SGC page on our website doesn't have links from this school year. So certainly we can make sure we get that updated with recordings from previous conversations.
Yeah, that would be great because some of it does build on each other in terms of some of the historical data and now talking through where we're at in terms of decision making. Any
There
more
is a-
questions?
There is a question in Spanish around getting information around multilingual translation and the schools to know if that is something that is being a part of the reduction.
No, there's nothing planned right now on multilingual services reduction. That's something we've been prioritizing as we know there's a lot of needs in that area.
And interpretation specifically was the question.
No, nothing related to interpretation.
But we do want to remind everyone that in this current year's budget, there was an increase. And that is staying the same for next year. There was a lot of feedback. We engaged with some of you that are on the call, and recommendations for added interpretation translation services. And so that was increased, and that is not a proposed reduction for next year.
And that is all the questions we have at this moment.
Okay, and we'll have more time for questions and, like I mentioned, a survey that you can participate in. So we will get to it then, and I will make sure we get to this question on the grade levels when we get to that slide. Before we get into some of the school process, I do want to highlight where we're at in the legislative advocacy work, because that is the other part of this equation. So for those who have been following, the legislator passed for this current fiscal year, so FY25, an increase to the special education excess cost grant. So I think that's a victory from the standpoint of advocacy. We saw movement in this current fiscal year. We're still tracking to see what that would mean for next year and evaluating what that would mean for us. We also have seen in the governor's budget, sustaining the cap on general education magnet tuition, supporting the full funding of the ECS formula, opportunities for pilot programs related to special education, and like I mentioned, working with the city on specific initiatives. So we have seen some movement, but that category that is highlighted in blue is really where we're focused right now. And this is where we've been advocating to add a special education factor to the state funding formula, because right now it does not include one. And the good news is there's currently a bill that's been proposed. It's Senate and House Bill 1511 that does have a piece in there around not only adding a weight for special education, but also increasing the amounts for other student groups and increasing the base amount that every student gets. And so this next slide just gives a bit more information about this bill. And what you'll see there with the QR code is a letter to your legislature if you want to advocate for this. We really want everyone possible to be advocating for this. It would mean really big things for Hartford because, again, it's increasing the amount for all students and then the amounts for economically disadvantaged students, for concentrated poverty, and for multilingual learners, as well as adding funding for special education. And so given the population that we have and the needs that we have, this would be significant money for our school district. And so we're encouraging everyone here, and tell all your friends, to advocate for this bill specifically, because it's exactly what we would need to be able to deal with some of the issues we've been having and invest more in the places that we most need to. So that was a bit. Is there any more questions, Paul, before I move to the next section?
I don't see any additional, no.
Okay. So really the message there is encouraging you all to advocate for additional funding because that means fewer reductions that we will need to make. Okay, we are now going to get into where we're at in the school budget process and how some of those changes that I talked through are playing out at that school level. So this is just a reminder of the timeline that the superintendent talked through. At the same time we're doing this session, this week is when schools are meeting to finalize some of their budget decisions. So all the central office teams met to provide feedback to schools. They'll have those conversations this week to come to some of their numbers for the budget for next year on number of staff, in what areas, and other non-salary expenses. This is just highlights what could cause changes in a school's budget from year to year. So one piece that I mentioned earlier is enrollment. And so if more students are expected at that school next year, there might be higher staffing. If there's fewer students expected, there might be lower, because a lot of the formulas for how schools get staff are dependent on how many students they have. Another piece of this is student need. So if the student needs at that school have changed, if they have more special education students, more multilingual learners, they would see increases in those types of staff, or conversely, decreases if they have fewer of those students. They also might change based on school priorities. So this is where schools are making decisions with their dollars. So they might choose to do something different. Last year they had a teacher. This year they want a counselor. So they are making some decisions that are based on the strategic plan and based on their own school priorities. The final piece is revenue availability. So as mentioned, we're confronting the deficit, and so that affected what we could allocate both to school teams and district teams. It also exists at the school level because schools have grants a lot of times that they have access to, but they might have had a grant this year that is no longer available next year, and that could impact some of their funding. So it's both as a district as a whole, but also for each individual school. Some of them have their own funding streams through those grants. I'm now going to go into the details about how we allocate to schools and some of the changes we made for this year. And as I go, Paul, I'll plan to do questions at the end, but if you think there's something that's better to address when I'm on a particular slide, just let me know. So there's two ways that we give funding to school sites. One is through positions. So there's a set of positions that come through the equity-based starter budget that are based on student enrollment. So however many kids, you get this many teachers, this many counselors, etc. There's also a set of positions that are allocated by the district team, and those are based on school and student need. So things like special education, bilingual resource teachers. Schools then also get a pot of dollars. And we'll go over those types of dollars when we get to those slides, but there's a few different sources that schools have to fund their school. What you will now see, and this is a lot of information, but we wanted to be transparent with exactly how this works at the school site. This is the formulas that exist at the school site for the types of staff that they get allocated directly. So you'll see this, and then you'll see some of the changes for this year. So you see things like principals, every school gets a principal. The pieces I wanted to call out was around elementary, middle, and high school teachers. So elementary, the change that we made was around separating out the allocation they get for their classroom teacher from what they get for their unified arts or electives or specials. So things like art, music, and PE, those are now two separate formulas. And so the classroom teachers are at the class size maximum, so the contractual maximum we have with the teachers union. And then specials teachers are essentially so all kids have access to art, music, PE, and that teachers are able to have their time to plan. Middle school, we did not make any changes in this area. They have ratios at grade 6 of 21.6 to 1. So for every 21.6 students, they get a teacher. At grade 7 and 8, that is 22.4. And then at the high school level, we didn't change the allocation rule itself. So it's 21 students is one teacher, but instead of rounding up, so if you were at 21.1 teachers, that might have been 22 last year, that would only be 21 this year. And so these changes combined is what led to about 1 teacher difference per school. But again, it doesn't include some of those one-time positions that existed just for this year because those didn't go through this formula. These are some of the other positions. So you can see counselor, social worker, we didn't make any changes there. Executive assistant, and then we added office assistant so that every school has at least one. We got a lot of feedback from school leaders that that was a really important role to have in every building. And then this part's important because you won't see positions allocated for the behavior tech, student engagement specialist, or family and community support provider. However, and I'll go over this in a couple slides, schools had a bucket of their Title I funding, their discretionary funding, to decide which of these they wanted. And like I mentioned, they have to have at least a 0.5 FCSSP because of how important that role is and the board setting a guardrail around it. So that is how positions have been allocated to school sites. The other types of positions they have, as mentioned, are ones that district teams allocate based on that school's needs. So anything related to special education, that's going based on individual student needs. Same with bilingual resource teachers. And then things like custodians might be based on the size of the building, school security officers. And I will highlight that does tie to one of those reduction options. Again, not to any of the positions at school sites, but there's some positions that float across school sites that are on the table right now as a reduction option. But otherwise, no changes to the special education teachers or staff, to the bilingual teachers or staff, nurses, custodians, or other kind of alternative programming for students. Yeah, Paul, were you gonna jump in or?
Well, just wondering if you want to pause there, because we do have some questions that have stacked
Yeah,
up.
let's
So-
pause there.
So I think the superintendent was going to respond to the first one, which is at the last finance committee meeting, there was talk about the city taking over community schools funding. And so superintendent, did you want to take that one?
Yeah, just want to make sure that that has not been confirmed. These are actually suggestions that we're making to the mayor about different costs that we have that they could support with. An example, some of you might remember that the city last year picked up the cost of the crossing guards. And so we're planning and hoping that that is still the same for this year. And we're adding additional things that they can potentially support with. In case, right, they identify a one-time funding, they could, that's an idea for community schools. They could help support, for example, the partnership that we have with Ready CT, who supports some of our career pathways in our high schools. So we're trying to find different opportunities for our partners at the city to support with costs. So no decisions yet, but we continue to give ideas.
Yeah, the next one is a question around, well, it's a concern expressed about the timeline in terms of SGCs giving input into their school budget. And then the question is, when is the final deadline for the second budget review, second round of conversations with SGCs?
So that is over the course of this week, and next week is when principals should be meeting with their SGCs for the second time. So they were waiting to get feedback from central office teams. And so that is happening this week. And then they should be setting up meetings with you all or with SGCs to talk through some of that feedback and make those final decisions. And so that would be this week or next week is what was on the calendar in terms of meeting with SGCs to review kind of some of that feedback and final decisions. And acknowledge, I know we've acknowledged this before, acknowledge it is a quick timeline. That 4/15 deadline, we're working quickly towards it, but that is what is in the timeline now for meeting with SGCs.
Caitlin, do you want, you've said this before, Caitlin, but I know, you're the new CFO, so you came in December. Do you want to say a little about some of your thoughts about how you see this in a future year in terms of trying to give more space for those conversations?
Yes, I definitely came in at an interesting time in terms of developing the budget. And so I have a priority for next year of making sure that we get SGCs and community feedback earlier on in the process, and just having you all be part of school budget conversations, even in the fall, just to understand even how did the budget decisions that happened this year, how are they going, and what does that mean we might want to do differently for next year? So that's definitely a priority for me. I also got a chance to work with our students, the student leadership group, and they were also exploring school budgets, and they also want to be part of the process. And so I think there's a lot that, at least from me, learning this year, that I absolutely have it as one of my biggest priorities for next year, to make sure there's more involvement early on, and that some of that thinking is happening way ahead of time, from even getting the budget information for the next year. So totally appreciate that it feels quick, and I totally agree. And that is something that we're going to work on for next year.
There's a question about resource teachers, and a question sort of from a previous conversation about, the question speaks to resource teachers as volunteers, but I think it's also just a question generally about, is there an allocation for a resource teacher position?
Yeah, so there actually is not an allocation for a resource teacher, and that's not a shift. That's just has always been true. But schools can decide to use some of their discretionary funding to fund a resource teacher. And so that's a teacher that would often help. It could be math or with literacy, to help specific groups of students who might need more support in those areas. So we do have several schools who are choosing to use some of their funding for a resource teacher, but it's not something that gets allocated to every school.
And Caitlin, you spoke to this a little bit talking about Title I, but the reference to Title I block grants, and just, how we're just, if you can talk about how we're deploying the Title I funding to schools this year.
Yes, and I'm just going to go straight to the slide because that will have some of the information on it, and then we can make sure to get to all of the questions as well. But this is something that's new for this year, is deploying the Title I funding directly to school sites. So just a bit on Title I, it's federal funding. It's intended specifically for economically disadvantaged students, and it is meant to be allocated to school sites so that they're making decisions about it with their SGCs, with their school communities. It's pretty expansive in terms of what you can do with it. Definitely things like instructional support, so having a resource teacher, having an additional teacher to lower class sizes, but also non-instructional, so counselors, anything related to the social work, physical, mental health, the wide range of services, post-secondary support, mentoring, behavioral, just a wide range of things that Title I can be used for. And so the amount actually of Title I allocated to schools is higher than what they would have gotten just in the equity-based starter budget formula, either last year or this year. And so the total amount is actually $5 million more than what would have been allocated just in the equity-based starter budget. And so just as a way to conceptualize that, the amount per pupil in the equity-based starter budget was between $260 and $580, versus Title I is about $1,000 for each economically disadvantaged student. And we have a pretty high population of economically disadvantaged students. So overall, it was more for schools than what they would have received. And that's why we're having them use those dollars to make decisions like behavior tech, student engagement specialists, additional teachers, resource teachers, family and community support providers. Really, the thought is you have this money up to you to decide what to do with it, knowing that that funding is intended to support our highest need students.
There's a question about what happens to funding for special education. If there's funding in the budget for a special education teacher, but we're not able to fill that position, what happens to the funding?
Oh, do you want to speak to that a bit, Paul?
Sure. I mean, there's a couple things there, because I think part of what I hear in that question is what's happening in terms of meeting the students' need, and then I'm hearing also what happens with the money. So there is, I mean, the reality is, if we don't fill a teaching position, the money doesn't get spent for the teaching position if we don't have somebody in that role. And so that there's a couple things that can happen. If there's another way, an alternative way to provide services to the student where we can use that money in a different way, the money can get repurposed. But then also we do in our budget understand that there is going to be a certain amount of what we call vacancy savings in the budget, and that is built into our budget assumption. And so, it's some of that, even in a time or when we're not struggling with as many vacancies as we are now, there's always going to be some money that you budget for positions that doesn't get spent in any given year, just because you have that regular turnover that happens. Superintendent, I can't tell if you wanted to jump in on this one as well.
I didn't hear if you talked about compensatory time.
Yeah, that was the other. So that was
Right.
sort of what I was alluding to, right? So if we don't, if we're not able to meet what's in the student's IEP relative to their special education teacher, we then have to provide compensatory services. And so we can take that money and put that towards paying for those services.
We take some of that money, not we can, we take some of that money to provide the supports either, right? Some of you know, some of it happens during vacation. April, for example, vacation, and specifically most of it throughout the summer.
The next question is, it's more of a point, but wanted to emphasize the importance of children getting into the school they're most interested in terms so that they achieve the best outcomes. And I think I can probably speak to that one as well. Superintendent, I know you can as well if you want, but we certainly recognize the importance of, right, if a student has a particular interest or passion, them being in a school that aligns to that interest or passion is, we understand the point, right? They're going to receive better outcomes. We also recognize that we operate in this ecosystem of school choice that is driven through the chef agreement and through the state, and that dictates a lottery for the most part, right? So for placement in almost all of our schools, it's a lottery-based process that frankly does not take student interest into account. And that's the reality that we currently operate in. There's a question, I think, for parents who are asking parents to comment on whether or not the positions are needed. And I'm not sure what slide this is referencing, but it's asking, for parents to comment on it. And as I'll just point people to the survey we're going to do at the end. So if folks have comments on particular positions that you think are critical or positions you think are less critical, that would be something we'd love for you to put into the survey that we get to at the end of the meeting. There is a clarification, I think, on the earlier question about community schools. And so I think we were answering a question about the city, an ask for the city to potentially fund our community school partnerships. There's a clarification about not community school, but community-based groups. And so I don't fully understand the question, but we don't generally provide funding to community-based groups outside of our full-service community school partnerships. And Janelle, I see, clarified that in the chat. So the next question is in Spanish. So if somebody can jump in and help me.
Question is relative to special education and our students that receive special education, aren't they supposed to be in a specific class just for them? Oftentimes when they're mixed in regular classes, if the other students are not informed, that there might be challenges or some students might feel uncomfortable, right? And neither student is at fault. And so so I can respond in English because we have translation in Spanish. Right, so every individualized education plan, IEP, is determined by a team. And ideally, it is to support the least restrictive environment, which is why students oftentimes are part of the regular education setting, unless there is something else that is determined at that group, at the planning and placement team meeting, the PPT, that will change the individualized education plan. And it might entail students being pulled out for a specific amount of time to deliver their services.
So there's some dialogue in the chat, and it sounds like some questions are getting answered around the community schools thing in the chat. So I'm going to move us on to one other. There's a question again about SGCs, and what I would say, this is an observation that in a school, parents have not been provided meeting minutes or invited to SGC meetings for several years. What I would say on that one is, please let us know in the survey. It helps us if in the survey you can let us know what school that is, because certainly we would want to follow up. Because, and somebody just posted a comment about the requirements relative to SGCs. And so, that's on us to follow up and make sure that our schools are following the procedures relative to SGCs. And so if you could share in the survey that we do at the end of the meeting, the school and the concerns you have with the SGC process, we can certainly follow up on that. And then I think that's it you know, there's a couple observations and comments in the chat, but I think Caitlin, you can probably move forward because I think that speaks to the questions we have at this moment.
Okay, yeah, and I really appreciate all of the engagement, and I know we only have about 5 minutes left, and so I want to make sure we're almost at the end, but like Deputy Foster mentioned, I want to make sure we get that survey to you so you can provide us additional questions, how we can follow up with you if you'd like to be followed up with, and any input that you have. And the more specific you can be, the better, as he mentioned. So I'm going to move us in that direction. One more piece we did just want to cover before we get to that survey is just examples of other types of grants schools have. So this would be something that would come up as you're looking at a school budget or in your SGC meeting. Different schools have different types of grants they have access to outside of just that Title I piece. So it's things like comprehensive school improvement. The state gives additional funding for schools who have been designated as need of improvement based on performance. There's also things like the Perkins Grant, which is meant for career and technical education. And so these aren't all of them. I just wanted to give a couple examples of different schools might have access to different grants based on their needs or school level that come oftentimes from the state or the federal government. So that's what we wanted to cover just in terms of how school budgets work, where we're at in the process, and again, appreciate all of the engagement. The next pieces here really are that QR code is going to go to a survey, and I think we're going to have someone drop it in the chat as well if that's easier. So again, that's just questions around what questions do you have for us? What input would you like to provide? Again, be as specific as possible, and if you want, you can leave your contact information so we can follow up with you. As mentioned, SGCs are another place where these conversations will continue. And then we will be having a budget hearing later on. I believe April 1st will be the date for that. And so there'll be more communication about that. But April 1st would be the date for the budget hearing. So that will be us coming back to you with even more updates, both on the legislative advocacy side and the revenue we think we're going to get, and on some of these proposed reductions we've talked about. And like we mentioned, participating in our advocacy work, in addition to being involved at your school site, is one of the most important things you can do. And so really encourage you all to get involved, to send the letters to your legislatures. We're going to be doing everything we can to testify related to that. And so just keep doing the work to advocate for more funding for Hartford Public Schools. So I will pause there. Anything that Deputy Foster you want to add, or Superintendent?
I want to thank everybody for joining us, for the questions. Please give us your feedback. Every time that we have, whether it's an in-person or virtual, we gather all of the themes, the trends that we hear. And we really, our Board of Education is really interested in really hearing from community. And so it's so important for you all to share what the thinking is and how, what we are thinking about is going to impact at the local level at your schools. And please, again, send a letter to for advocacy to your legislator. And I scanned it, but I just want to make sure, does everyone in the community know how to reach out to the legislator? Because if that's we might need to send that information as well.
We could add that in.
Yes,
I can talk with Pedro.
Great.
Okay. Okay. Well, in that case, I think that wraps it up. I don't know if Alejandro, there's anything you want to say, but again, thank you so much for coming, and please fill out the survey and the letter to your legislator.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening. We'll be sending out communication regarding our April 1st budget hearing as soon as we finalize the information. Have a great evening, everyone. Buenas noches.
Take care. Adios.